Dr. David Perkins presents Lawrence Du Garde Peach and the Ladybird Adventures from History series, Peach in History and the History of Peach. This is a story that for me started in the summer of 2019. My wife and I went on holiday in the Peak District. We have two children, the twins. They were about 16 months old at the time. I had bought a guidebook that I thought was in keeping with our new circumstances. We were sitting in our holiday cottage. My wife looked at the guidebook in my hand and looked at me. She said, "Why have you bought the old people's guidebook? What are you doing?" I had no real answer. My wife's a lawyer and she just had a whole lot of work come in that she had to deal with. So later that evening I found myself reading rather sheepishly, the old people's guidebook more in depth than I might otherwise have done. I'm not sure what I'd done with my life before I rediscovered L Du Garde Peach, but I turned a page in the old people's guidebook and found his name right there. L Du Garde Peach. There was a short paragraph about the Ladybird book author and the theatre he'd built in Great Hucklow, Derbyshire. I found that Peach had lived in a bungalow close to Great Hucklow in the nearby village of Fullow. A few days later, we were driving back from Eam, and I said to my wife, "I'd just like to go and have a look at Fullow." She said, "Why? What's there?" I said, "The bungalow." "What bungalow? What are you talking about?" L Du Garde Peach. Anyway, we turned off and went to the village. Duck pond, tick. Chapel, tick. Pub, tick. Bungalow. Where was the bungalow? I felt despondent. There was no bungalow I could see. I felt the trail had gone cold. Had I been pixie-led? Was Peach grounded in gossamer? Would I ever really track down Lawrence Du Garde Peach? The extraordinary life and career of the playwright and author Lawrence Du Garde Peach, 1890 to 1974, is little known today. If he is known at all, he is remembered as the best-selling author of most of the titles in the Ladybird Adventures from History series. In strikingly modern fashion, L Du Garde Peach's career comprised several careers. He involved himself in a bewildering number of enterprises: infantry officer, teacher, punch humorist, university lecturer, university fundraiser, writer, pioneer of early radio, popular radio personality, magazine editor, producer of historical pageants, theatrical entrepreneur, Ladybird history book author. Here we have a man who scored notable firsts, particularly with respect to his career as a pioneer of radio broadcasting at the early BBC. His play Light and Shade 1924 is commonly regarded as the second play written specifically for radio to have been broadcast. Peach was the first to spoof the new phenomenon of the radio weather forecast, as well as the similarly new phenomenon of running commentaries on sports matches. He was the first to spoof events from British history, heterodyne histories, historical events as they might have been in 1927. His radio plays The Mystery of Mary Celeste 1931 to much acclaim, and his Mutiny on the Bounty 1932 were the first dramatizations of these famous stories. Peach achieved formal recognition in his own lifetime, including a D.Lit 1964 from Sheffield University and an OBE in 1972 for his services to literature and the arts. He achieved the informal recognition of becoming a household name, particularly in the 1930s, 40s and 50s. He was one of the most popular stars of BBC radio. Peach was astonishingly productive. He wrote more than 400 plays, many of them specifically written for radio. He had a long association with the BBC's Children's Hour and was one of the most popular and requested children's broadcasters. His broadcast touched millions and led to him becoming a known figure in the world of radio as far away as Australia, New Zealand and Canada. What's in a name? Even when L Du Garde Peach was a nationally known figure from BBC radio in the 1930s and 40s, children, adults even, sometimes said L Du Garde as if it was one long name. L Du Garde Peach continues to attract attention as if it's imbued with a special quality. Alan Bennett said, "There is the L Du Garde Peach, a name that seems to exist purely as a name. I can't see anyone being pointed out to me as L Du Garde Peach, but this is partly because I wouldn't know what sex to look for. The Du Garde somehow masculine, the Peach feminine, and so the person unimaginable." In actuality, L Du Garde Peach was just plain Lawrence Peach, known to his friends as Laurie. The Ladybird Adventures from History series was a series of inexpensive, colourfully illustrated mini hardback history books for children that sold millions of copies from the 1950s to the 1980s. For L Du Garde Peach, this was a retirement project to the extent that he ever retired and represented just one facet of his creative output. Ladybird Books enthusiasts, of which there are many, tend to have views tinged with nostalgia. For many enthusiasts, Peach sparked off a lifelong love of history. However, the academic community has not always been as welcoming. To his critics, Peach produced an oversimplified, narrow-minded history suffused with the illusions of post-war Britain. Peach was not a completely free spirit because his publisher had limited interest in cutting across the grain of conventional views. In Ladybird Books, there was a celebration of nature but also of progress, such as the building of motorways. One might also find stereotypical portraits of family life. Loughborough-based printers Wills and Hepworth tapped into the growing post-war demand for children's books. They weren't a publishing house, they had just got into children's book publishing in wartime as a result of disruption to normal business. The format of the books, the standard 54-page book including end papers, comes from the war economy standard and the need to use every scrap of the largest piece of paper their presses could print. Wills and Hepworth had originally intended to discontinue publishing children's books at the end of World War II and to go back to printing glossy brochures for the car industry of the West Midlands. It was through the sheer determination of one employee, Douglas Keane, that the directors of the company changed their minds. Keane happened to have a wife and mother-in-law who were trained artists. Douglas Keane worked with them on a homemade mock-up of the book that became British Birds and Their Nests, 1953. This book was the first title in the Ladybirds' New Nature series. Keane's persistence paid off. A second print run of 50,000 copies of British Birds and Their Nests quickly followed. By the time Keane retired in 1974, there had been a huge growth in sales. 24,000 of standard format books were sold in 1946, and this increased to 24 million by 1974. Wills and Hepworth found talented authors and illustrators to produce the material for a one-off fixed fee. Ladybird Books became a publishing phenomenon. In November 1983, Peach was profiled in a segment of the BBC programme Time Watch. It was noted that he had sold 13.5 million copies of his books. Whether Peach was a historian or just a writer of histories is open to question, but he certainly shifted books. The best-selling 85 million copies and the longest-running Ladybird series was the Keywords reading scheme, more commonly known as the Peter and Jane books. Some of you will remember them. They also enjoyed export success across the world, particularly in Pakistan, India, and Singapore. The Adventures from History sub-series began in 1956 with Peach's Alfred the Great. Few individual writers were as well placed to write on a range of topics including Stone Age Man, Julius Caesar, William the Conqueror, Oliver Cromwell, Charles II, Florence Nightingale, Captain Cook, Charles Dickens. Peach had experience of writing historical pen portraits for Children's Hour, and he presented artful, potted versions of the past that resonated with a wide audience. The focus of Adventures from History tended to be on how powerful personalities, predominantly but not exclusively men, shaped history. There was some error and bias as well as variation in quality. Stone Age Man, for instance, for example, did not stand up well even against what was known at the time. And here we see in this slide of Stone Age Man in Britain, we have Peach conjuring this person Quickfoot. We do not know what language these people spoke or what sort of names they had for one another. If a man could run very fast, they probably called him Quickfoot, of course, in their own language. And then Quickfoot single-handedly invents huts and also flint tools. Mrs. Quickfoot makes an appearance, and she invents cereal cultivation and also porridge. In Oliver Cromwell, Oliver was depicted as being abducted as an infant by a monkey and getting into a childhood fight with Charles I. There was a winged Viking helmet depicted on the front cover of Alfred the Great. According to Peach, King John and the Richard Lionheart were bad, Mary I was a strange woman, and Captain Scott's expedition was one of the most gallant ventures in the history of our race. At the same time, Peach presented the Puritans as a misunderstood group. Oliver Cromwell was held up as a good man, although there was reference in passing to cruelty in Ireland. That aspect of his time in power was arguably brushed over. The book on Napoleon was positive. There were no comparisons to Hitler, for instance, but there wasn't much on Napoleon and women or Napoleon and Haiti. Peach is remembered for the Ladybird books, which are seen as putting forward a kind of particular kind of history, but there was certainly much more to Peach than a mere producer of patriotic homilies. As a cutting-edge radio dramatist, Peach did not shy from controversial issues including war, the arms race and pacifism. In Patriotism Limited 1937, he was the subject of BBC internal censorship and pulled from the air, a decision that was reported around the world. Night Sky, 1937, sought to bring home the realities of modern warfare. Peach also wrote a play about the First World War with no men in the cast, Home Fires, 1930. He became known also for hard-hitting social problem radio dramas. Bread, 1932, was a family farming saga of poverty and emigration from the agricultural depression of the 1840s to the Great Depression. Three Soldiers, 1933, highlighted the predicament of ex-soldiers from the First World War who were thrown on the dole. Several of Peach's radio plays touched on racial issues. His stance on the subject was more nuanced than many of his contemporaries, and his attitudes ahead of his time. In Ingredient X, 1929, he presented corporate greed and the exploitation of Africa. In John Hawkins' Slave in 1933, Peach adapted Hakluyt's 16th century account of the notable voyages and showed how Hawkins, like other Elizabethan explorers, had to make profits from slave trading to secure the monarch's support. In the Cohort Marches, an episode of the Roman occupation, 1937, Peach recast then contemporary issues of colonialism in the context of Roman Britain. As the author of more than 400 plays and many books and articles, Peach tried to avoid producing a surfeit of his own work, and occasionally adopted amusing strategies to keep his name off the programme. For instance, the great Hucklow players once presented a Chinese comedy entitled The Beautiful Garden, which was attributed on the programme to the Emperor Ming-Huan of the Tang dynasty. Peach confessed, this in fact was me. He then added mischievously, once I did the same thing with a Russian play. I attributed it to a fictitious author, and afterwards a bright young man from the BBC approached me. Of course, he told me earnestly, I'm familiar with most of this chap's other plays, though I haven't come across this one. Peach let the man from the BBC go away happy in his own delusion. Peach is more interested in saying something for dramatic effect than in strict accuracy or balance. If he could have things always round, then that was better still. So in Henry VIII, we have, in earlier centuries, monasteries had served a useful purpose. The monasteries had become immensely rich and the monks fat and lazy. They're all fat and lazy. Few people were sorry to see them closed down. Increased taxes were necessary, and the north of England rose in revolt. So this is a tax-led interpretation, and you could perhaps say a kind of a Marxist interpretation, which is a little bit unusual given that Peach's reputation for being a kind of an establishment figure. So certainly Peach is an idiosyncratic author. The books were period pieces. They reflected the understanding of history at the time, or the common understanding of history at the time, and issues arose in part from the way adventures from history were written. The idea of one author without a research team for a huge range of topics would not be considered today. Nonetheless, Peach wrote children's books with unusual flair, elegance, and sophistication. Here we have the entry from the Dictionary of National Biography by E.D. Macinnes, who was a kind of historian of the social history of music. It says, Peach's efforts were anything but run-of-the-mill regurgitations of standard textbook material. I mean, that's probably true. In spite of their concise format, the Ladybird books are factually irreproachable. I think he's on less solid ground here, and presented in a lively prose style calculated to awaken interest in Britain's cultural and political history. And here we have the images from that book, where the illustrator John Kenny is let loose with the story of the monkey abduction of the infant Oliver Cromwell, and also the childhood fight with Charles I. But there we are. Also, Cromwell has this is one of my kind of favourite ones. Peach tries to counter the sort of negative stereotype of Puritans, and also he has here with the William Prynne, who is supposedly made his stand for tax reasons, as Peach asserts. So, Peach and history, who were the artists? The Ladybird books were a partnership between Peach and a number of illustrators. In most cases, the illustrator was John Kenny, 1911 to 1972. He was a commercial artist and illustrator who illustrated 31 of the Ladybird Books titles between 54 and 72. He was a D-Day veteran, and although not an official war artist, had recorded the landings and his regiment's progress with drawings made firsthand. Kenny had worked on a number of the Ladybird series, including the Silver Arrow, Robin Hood Adventure, Tootles the Taxi, The Circus Comes to Town. Separately, he's also responsible for Reverend Audrey's Railway series, Thomas the Tank Engine, between 957 and 62. Kenny's illustrations are sort of crammed with details, just so much going on. The pictures complemented the text and helped drive the story along and created an atmosphere, a feeling. Kenny and Peach worked on, I think, 29 or so of the adventures from history books, the first being Alfred the Great in 956, and the last one being the Pilgrim Fathers in 1972, before ill health broke up the partnership. There was also Frank Hampson, 1918 to 1985, another World War II veteran. He was the creator of Dan Dare, amongst other things. He did the illustrations for Kings and Queens books 1 and 2, and a couple of the other adventures from history series. Hampson loved trying to squeeze in as much detail as possible while still maintaining the overall look of the image. He often used friends and family members as models. He took photos of them, sometimes in costume and the poses he wanted. People today see Ladybird Books as a bit old-fashioned, but quite a lot of then quite up-to-date technology went into their production. Hampson, for instance, bought one of the first Polaroid cameras to get an immediate image of what he wanted. The images in the Kings and Queens books are quite vibrant, but they're not as colourful as the originals we'll see in a minute. I guess there were limits to printing technology at the time. There's also Frank Humphreys, 31st of March 1911 until March 1993. He'd worked as a painter and illustrator. He was a cartographer in the War Office, plotting maps with paratroopers. He amassed a huge collection of kind of Western gear and antique guns and became a specialist in kind of Western comics. In 1952, he took over the Eagles' Riders of the Range. He loved the world of the cowboy and himself became a crack shot and was featured on television featuring his kind of quick draw. He also had the honorary sheriff's badge was awarded the honorary sheriff's badge from Bexar County, Texas. Though I don't think he actually ever went to America, which just shows that you don't need to go anywhere necessarily to exercise imagination. And he did some of the later adventures from history books, including Henry VIII. Here we have the copy of the Battle of Crecy from Kings and Queens books 1 by Frank Hampson. On the left-hand side, we have the image from the published image from the book. On the right-hand side, we have the original by Frank Hampson, which is a little bit larger and more vibrant in its colours. Someone asked if I could say something about LDG's kind of creative process. Here's an example drawn from an exhibition of Ladybird Books and artists that's been going around the country, and it was in Canterbury a few years ago. Helen Day, who created the exhibition, also runs the fabulous Ladybird enthusiast website, Ladybird Fly Away Home, and she has a letter from L Du Garde Peach to his publisher in 1968 about the draft of King John. So, the question was, did Henry II have a beard? In all the drawings Peach had seen, he'd been clean shaven. In the middle one, Peach said, should there not be more monks? Otherwise it looks like a poor turnout. He thought on the right, he thought the cottage was too smart. He said just the sort of cottage that commuters would look for and covet. It should be really miserable and squalid, something that even a London stockbroker would turn up his nose at. Also, we have King John. He wanted John Kenny to produce a kind of a good image of looting and burning. He said he was worried about the image of the quote-unquote signing of Magna Carta. Peach said he thought it should be so angled that the king might be affixing a seal or signing, as he says, thus we satisfy everybody and avoid complaints from the wretched little perfectionists. So the history of Peach. In 1939, Peach was asked by the BBC to give a pen portrait of his career, and this is what he came up with. He says, was born in Sheffield but not recently. This event, the importance of which to L Du Garde Peach is impossible to overestimate, happened 48 years ago, but is still being talked about in Sheffield. After trying whooping cough, measles and scarlet fever, decided to look elsewhere for a career. Semi-educated at Manchester Grammar School and assaulted English and German universities, managed partly by stealth and partly by guile to become a Master of Arts and a Doctor of Philosophy. Served in the war with the 8th Battalion Manchester Regiment and later in the Intelligence Corps. The Allies won. His work with the Intelligence Corps, having entirely exhausted his intelligence, became, in 1919, a university lecturer until, realising the entire impossibility of ever being able to impart to others all that he knew himself, he metamorphosed himself into a kind of author. He still is. His hobby is to try anything once, except fretwork and folk dancing. His motto is, it's always possible to be serious without being solemn. So he was in the Manchester Regiment. We tend to think of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers as being the literary regiment of World War I, but there were quite a few notable authors in the Manchester, such as Wilfred Owen, the historian Richard Tawney, L Du Garde Peach. There's a problem with Peach's own account of his own history in that he actually became a university lecturer in 1922, not 1919, as he claimed here. So Peach's own history is unreliable, but maybe telling the truth would have interrupted the flow, arguably for no real benefit. It's said that the truth is often either a half-truth or a truth and a half. Let's look at Peach's background in a little more detail. Peach was born in Sheffield near the university. His mother was descended from Huguenot refugees, which is probably where the Du Garde name came from originally. His father, Charles Peach, was a Unitarian minister active in liberal politics. They're a serious-minded family with a social conscience. In the last years of the 19th century, Reverend Charles Peach, along with the Reverend Lawrence Scott of Manchester, established a summer holiday programme for poor children from Manchester and Sheffield in the Peak District, in the Derbyshire village of Great Hucklow. The Reverend Lawrence Scott was the brother of C.P. Scott, the well-known editor of the Manchester Guardian. The charity the two reverends established still exists today as Send a Child to Hucklow. The idea was to provide inexpensive holidays and the delights of the countryside for children from the slums. In many cases, it was often the only holiday most of them had. The actor Ricky Tomlinson benefited from the scheme in the 1950s. In later years, he remembered going on a holiday to Wales, but the organisation had to put him straight about that and remind him it was Derbyshire. L Du Garde Peach attended school in Manchester, but he spent his summers in Great Hucklow, and he knew a fair amount about how the other half lived. L Du Garde Peach started his educational journey at an ordinary elementary school, but then won an open scholarship that entitled him to a place at Manchester Grammar School. He was a scholarship boy. He entered the school in 1903 and left in 1909. He took a keen interest in drama and appeared in several school productions. His outstanding abilities as an actor were soon revealed. He also took part in a school mock election in 1906 as a stand-in Liberal candidate, liberalism is a feature that would continue through the rest of his life. He stood for Derby for the Liberals in 1929, and though he didn't win, he increased the Liberal vote. One influence was J.L. Patton, who was High Master of Manchester Grammar when Lawrence Du Garde Peach was there. Peach said he had a kind of electric personality and passed it to those who came into contact with him. He was an inspirer. After leaving Manchester Grammar School in 1909, Peach won one of 6 university scholarships provided by Manchester City Council. He matriculated into Victoria Manchester University, which is originally a Unitarian foundation, to read for a degree in English language and literature. He came under the strong intellectual influence of one of the leading British academics at the time, Professor Charles Herford. Herford's son Siegfried was just a year younger than Lawrence Du Garde Peach and was a contemporary of his at MGS, who'd gone on to read for a degree in engineering at the university. Also there was Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was also in the engineering department at that time. And I think they helped build stages and stage sets for productions at the university. I'm not sure that Wittgenstein did, but certainly Siegfried Herford. So Siegfried Herford was a kind of prodigious mountain climber. Here he is pictured with George Mallory, but unfortunately Siegfried was killed in the First World War. In 1912, a young dynamic lecturer from the education department, James Shelley, gave a talk to the University English Society on the poet John Masefield even. The talk was so inspirational that it led to the foundation of the Manchester University Stage Society. The example of Shelley's efforts and the assumption of multiple roles, producer, chief actor, supervisor of costumes and set, can be seen running through Peach's later work. Peach graduated from Manchester in 1912 with a BA in English, third class. You kind of have to work quite hard these days to get a third class degree, or maybe not work. But certainly in those days, getting a third class degree was no bar to moving on to an MA, which he did in 1913. And then because you couldn't actually study for a PhD degree in this country, Peach moved to Germany. Later in life, Peach styled himself as MA PhD rather than BA MA PhD. As the product of a Northern Red Brick University education rather than Oxbridge, he'd always be something of an outsider, even when he was seen as an insider. So after graduation, Peach secured the position of a lecturer in English at the University of Göttingen, and that helped finance his enrollment as a doctoral student at the university. His employment commenced in December 1912. As might be expected, he taught English conversation, translation, literature, philology, an overview of the English university system. He left the university amid the rapidly deteriorating international situation in the summer of 1914. He cut it fine. He managed to get out of Germany just a matter of hours before the outbreak of war. One of his great friends, W.P. Lipscomb, who later became a successful film script writer, for example, A Town Like Alice 1956 and Dunkirk 1958, also suffered a close call at the outbreak of war. Peach recorded a tribute to his friend in 1958. On the outbreak of war, Lipscomb was playing the part of a German spy in the silent film version of An Englishman's Home, and was actually standing before a firing squad in the film when news came to the studio that we were at war with Germany. Lipscomb always insisted that the outbreak of war had reprieved him, but it also put him into the first Dorsets, and he was awarded the MC in France. He became a Punch contributor, as did Peach, and they had a big connection. They ended up co-writing plays together. L Du Garde Peach's life in theatre continued a long time spent at universities. His first play, the one-act tragedy Wind of the Moor, a Derbyshire theme play, was produced at Annie Horniman's Gaiety Theatre in Manchester in 1913. The independently wealthy Ibsen enthusiast Miss Horniman established the Gaiety Theatre as the first repertory theatre in Britain. It was also the most progressive theatre in the country and one of the first of its kind to seek to produce as opposed to reproducing what was already deemed acceptable on the Victorian stage. Free from commercial considerations, Miss Horniman's company produced classic and local plays for a new audience, an audience potentially including the working classes. One Manchester Grammar alumnus, Stanley Houghton, wrote a play first performed in 1912 that caused a sensation, Hindle Wakes. It was a major financial and critical success, as well as being a dialect play that managed to travel successfully to London and later New York, but its subject matter scandalised the British public. Peach was at the opening night and talked about it later in life. So, in 1914, the 24-year-old Peach had his first play performed in a theatre with a reputation for serious modern drama and in the local Lancashire idiom. Peach's reputation was spreading beyond Manchester. In April 1914, his single-act comedy, The Parting, was presented at the Royal Palace Theatre, Margate. Peach asserted in 1933 that of the three major institutions he had attended in Manchester, the Grammar School, the University and the Gaiety Theatre, it was what he saw and experienced in the last of these three that remained with him. The Gaiety fostered the vogue for the one-act play, which became a staple of Peach's later work. Taking inspiration from the Gaiety, Peach established his own theatre company and established a theatre that ran successfully from 1927 to 1971 in the Derbyshire village of Great Hucklow. So Peach was no simple Edwardian. Here we have a man who lined up with the future rather than with the past. When war broke out in 1914, LDG came back to the UK from Germany. He was commissioned into the 8th Hardwick Battalion of the Manchester Regiment. As an infantry officer in the First World War, Peach will have experienced a crash course in leadership, motivational speaking. He also doubtless gained experience of problem solving and teamwork in difficult and pressurised situations. He rose to the rank of captain, possibly because he was a German speaker. Peach was transferred to military intelligence. In March 1915, Peach's play The Man and the Moon won the prize awarded by John Masefield, president of the Manchester University Stage Society, for the best one-act play. Peach's comedy Sale by Auction was due to open on Tuesday the 13th, 1915 at the Princess Theatre, but there was a delay in approval from the wartime censor and the performance was delayed for a day. A pianist stepped into the slot on the opening night. Peach also learned to drive in 1915. He was an avid motorist for the rest of his life. 1915 saw another milestone. On 25th of September, he married Emily Marianne Leeming, who'd been a fellow student at Manchester She was the daughter of a dentist from a Unitarian background. Marion Peach qualified as a doctor with a specialism in dermatology, and marriage to a university-educated professional woman marked him out at the more progressive end of the then current social attitudes. At the end of the war, having been unable to complete the degree at Göttingen University, Peach benefited from a scheme devised to enable ex-servicemen to complete an uninterrupted educational course. He was enrolled as a doctoral student at the University of Sheffield, reading for a PhD in English. The title of his thesis, A Study of the Dramatic Relations of France, Spain, and England in the 17th Century. It demonstrated how dramatic themes and situations already used by leading European playwrights were adapted by English authors such as Dryden, utilising different stage conventions and more familiar modes of thought. Peach received the degree in the summer of 1921. He spent the academic year 1921-22 as an English master at Burnley Grammar School. At Burnley, if not before, Peach started to engage in freelance journalism. Over the next few years, Peach submitted sketches to such journals as London Opinion, The Humorist, Punch. By July 1922, he'd already had 6 pieces published in Punch. In 1922, he was appointed to a lectureship at what was then the University College of the South West of England. Elected in the English department, 1922 to 1926, he was also very active in the amateur dramatic scene in Devon, and was the founding inspiration for the Newton Abbot Repertory Company. It was founded as a result of one of his inspirational talks. The Newton Abbot Repertory Company enjoyed decades of success. I think it still exists today. Peach became one of the first official fundraisers for the University College of the South West in its attempt to gain full university status. Being a fundraiser is tricky, but I think Peach wanted to move on. He was an entertaining speaker, but he had other kind of fish to fry, and Exeter was a bit of an intellectual backwater in those days. He's a bit of a big fish in a small pond. For him, drama in the theatre world would be the most important thing. Also, he was making about £400 a year as an academic, but was soon making twice as much in addition from writing and radio work. He was the only academic at the university to run a car, a bullnose Morris. He lived in a hotel. He's just a bit too flash. I think the other academics probably hated it. In 1927, Peach dropped out of the academic rat race and went to live in Fulham, Derbyshire. Maybe academia was just too restrictive. There's too much bureaucracy, too much backbiting. People were too earnest. Plus, it just didn't really pay enough. Peach's father, Charles Peach, advised him against giving up the security of his academic job, telling him that writing was a, quote, chancy business. He established a home about 1.5 miles from Great Hucklow. Another figure, W.C. Seller from the Seller and Yateman combination, the 1066 and all that people, tried to do a similar thing a few years later. He dropped out of the rat race and went to live in a cottage, but he couldn't make it work and ended up becoming a teacher at Charterhouse. So Peach was no mere academic with a narrow focus. L Du Garde Peach established and also built his own theatre in the remote Derbyshire village of Great Hucklow. It ran successfully from 1927 until 1971. The theatre started out in the holiday home, but in 1938, Peach and his players themselves converted a building associated with the former lead mine into a purpose-built theatre. It had rake seating, affording a good view for every member of the audience. They excavated beneath the stage for dressing rooms. The work was completed part-time in a mere 3 months. And I guess for Peach, the Great Hucklow Village Players is probably his proudest achievement. Despite being 6 miles from the nearest railway station and located at 1,000 feet above sea level, the theatre played to packed audiences who came by car or bus or charabanc from the north of England and beyond. They were basically turning away twice as many people as they had seats for. It was a case of build it and they'll come. It became a kind of northern cultural phenomenon. There was no attempt to advertise, publicity and reviews were not sought, but the Great Hucklow Village Players quickly established a cult following by word of mouth. Peach ran his theatre company like a benevolent dictatorship. He carefully vetted each new applicant. He insisted on high standards and high production values. Peach was a strong proponent of the village drama movement and believed that ordinary people could achieve artistic success. He was ruthless at casting, but he recruited his actors from the ordinary working country people. He sought the authenticity of local accents and was a keen promoter of plays in the Derbyshire dialect. Performances were held when the moon was full to allow local people to walk home safely. L Du Garde Peach's theatre was the only theatre in Britain regulated by the phases of the moon. Peach was a dictator. You knew that you'd been selected for a part in his next play if there was a new script in your dressing room on the last night. The other thing about Peach was that he hated curtain calls. No one wants to see a lot of smirking amateurs in a row, he said. Peach liked gimmicks, like offering the audience a free orange, I suppose, rather like Shakespeare. Or they didn't really have oranges, but you can kind of see where he was going with this. Peach was a great champion of the amateur theatre, and his many one-act plays were a staple of many local drama societies from the 40s to the 1980s. He also devised plays for solely female casts. These well-crafted, popular plays were much performed by amateur groups, and that were for many years a staple of the Women's Institute productions up and down the country. Peach was part of and wrote plays for a kind of burgeoning amateur scene. In 1936, there were nearly 40,000 amateur dramatic societies in Britain, and nearly 1 million amateur actors out of a British population of 46 million. L Du Garde Peach was an active promoter of regional as well as local theatre. He was the driving force behind the Sheffield Repertory Theatre and served on the management board for many years. And he helped save it during World War II and then transform it into a popular centre of cultural and dramatic excellence. Peach's plays were also popular as school productions, as seen in the King's School, Canterbury in the 1950s. In August 1927, Lawrence Du Garde Peach found himself reminiscing about the early days of radio broadcasting. He started broadcasting in late 1922, but from the vantage of 1927, it felt like recalling those days felt like some kind of, as he said, some very ancient Victorian statesman writing his memoirs. Peach said that broadcasting in the early days was a more casual, more haphazard, in some ways, perhaps a more friendly business than it's now become. Stations were embryonic and experimental. Audiences were fewer, maybe 10,000 or so. In those far-off days, there was less sense of responsibility. The clockwork regularity and meticulous exactness of today were undreamed of. The station director was also quite like to be the announcer and the engineer in charge as well, when not telling humorous stories into the microphone or singing a few songs at the piano to help out. There was a cheery atmosphere, a cheery if makeshift atmosphere about the whole business in 1922. Peach started broadcasting on 2ZY. 2ZY was the name of a radio station broadcast by the British Broadcasting Company from Manchester between 1922 and 1927. Had its first test transmission in May 1922 and soon began regular broadcasts from November 1922, just a day after its sister station 2LO from London. The programmes were made and broadcast at first from the Metropolitan Vickers Electricity Works in Old Trafford. The ornate iron water tower was the site of the transmitter. I don't have a recording of the 2ZY call sign, but here is a recreation of one for the equivalent London station 2LO. Peach recalled, I was first introduced to the microphone by my friend Professor Pear of Manchester University. Pear was the first professor of psychology in the UK and was a pioneer in the study of shell shock. Peach ran into Pear one day in Manchester and Pear said to Peach that he, Pear, had been broadcasting. It was Professor Pear who put him in touch with the station manager, and a few days later Peach found himself at the works of the Metropolitan Vickers Company. His introduction to the microphone was really an introduction to the ordinary desk telephone, as you can see from the image on the right there, the desk on the right. Peach recalled, to this aloof and unresponsive thing, I talked and told stories for half an hour. Nothing happened. Can you sing? Asked the station director when I'd finished. Peach replied, I had been known to sing, but the encouragement I'd received on those occasions had never been particularly riotous. Somebody had promised to sing that evening, but as often was the case, had failed to show up. I suppose you know John Peel, said the station director said. Peach said, "We made a duet out of it." Peach continued, "It was the first instance of the broadcasting of community singing." The station director said thank you at the end of the evening and suggested that Peach could drop in whenever he wanted. Peach remarked, "This was my first advance booking from the BBC." As I said at the beginning, Peach contributed notably to the development of broadcast drama. In 1924 wrote one of the first plays the BBC put on air. The first radio play is commonly regarded as A Comedy of Danger by Richard Hughes from January 1924. And L Du Garde's play Light and Shade, October 1924, is commonly regarded as the second play written specifically for radio to have been broadcast. But that's not really the case. It was really the third original drama written for radio. The first one has been overlooked. Radio auntie Phyllis M. Twigg's The Truth About Father Christmas was broadcast on Christmas Eve 1923 out of Newcastle. Twigg has long been overlooked as a radio pioneer because she's a woman and she was writing for children. So what is commonly regarded as the world's first radio play, but was actually the second one, A Comedy of Danger by Richard Hughes, was broadcast in January 1924. I think it was a comedy only in the sense that no one died. I think Peach's Light and Shade was the first play that was a comedy in the sense of actually being funny. There was fun to be had at Manchester. Those early days were worthwhile, if only for the fun of the thing. Here's a 2ZY Manchester pioneered live music on radio, the origins of the BBC orchestras of today, children's programming, also drama aimed at adults. The station formed its own repertory company, the first radio station to do so. As the saying goes, what Manchester says today, the rest of the world says tomorrow. The early days of radio were heady and in some senses chaotic. Programming started off quite formally, playing gramophone records. Soon the early pioneers began to develop pretty much all the formats that can be heard in modern radio: live music, live drama, children's programming, phone-in, sports commentating, weather forecasts, news bulletins, etc. But there was an amateurish and haphazard feeling, an atmosphere of banter. Things were to become more structured and hierarchical and conformist later under Lord Reith, when banter was banned. In 1962, the BBC made a radio programme about the early days of radio, BBC Radio, and it included an interview with Peach.
So there you have the Avatar. What about the names? Who wrote those? As a rough guess, I would say L Du Garde Peach. I never stopped hearing his name on the radio when I was at that, and he's still writing plays. Randall Hurley went to see him. Does your memory go back to the time you wrote your first radio play?
Yes, I think that was in the following year, 1924. And in those days, nobody had written any radio plays because, after all, a play is something that you've got to see. So when I was asked to write one, I thought the only thing to do is to write a play. The scene which takes place in the dark. And I wrote about people coming home from a flat or light and shade. The electric light had failed. They toppled over things and so on. It was a really short comedy. After that, I wrote another one in which people were down in a coal mine where it was dark. Then somebody wrote one about people battened down in the hold of a ship. Then, of course, the dark places ran out and we had to think again. So we thought of making the atmosphere by sounds. And as background sounds, some of those we used were extraordinary. We did a broadcast ship by St. Irving. And we tried all sorts of things to make the sound of this great liner hitting the iceberg, like the Titanic in 1912. And we nearly wrecked the studio, breaking up boxes, smashing furniture, and finally we found the only way to do it, and the most effective way, was to crumple a wooden matchbox in the hand, very close to the mic, and it sounded terrific.
When listening to a broadcast, listeners hear voices speaking against music, the voices on the music fading away, to be replaced by the sound of, say, a trotting horse, the ringing bell, the swish of the sea. Radio drama was being created by as many as 9 separate studios, all controlled by the producer using the mixing desk, or as it was called, the dramatic control panel. Peach pioneered the use of sound effects to signal a change in scene, such as seagulls or waves, for instance. The early BBC had a microphone permanently at Bournemouth, so they'd have the sound of the waves on tap. Broadcast media was a new form of art in the 1920s, and Peach was keen to push experimentation to its limits. He was a aspiring modernist, or at least one who used modernist techniques. He was an innovator who developed radio drama in important directions and had a significant influence on its style and content. His play Ingredient X 1929, Paul Begg has argued, was the first convincingly radiogenic piece. It was the first to make the optimum aesthetic use of sound in radio transmission, and the first in which some of the main techniques of radio drama were brought into play together. Peach was a genuine innovator. He developed radio drama and history programs into a recognisably modern format. He used a variety of sound effects to reconstruct the past and to create a sound world for listeners that had the feel of authenticity. Second, Peach introduced convincingly natural everyday speech for characters from the past, which replaced the affected stage acting version of English. Peach was one of the first to use the device of an ordinary person to be the narrator of a radio play. Sometimes he used a page boy, for instance. We can experience Peach's innovation firsthand when we get an audio guide from an historic site, National Trust, English Heritage, that kind of thing. It's usually in narration by, say, the lady of the house or a maid, that kind of thing. That's pure Peach. He pioneered this on radio in the 1930s and 1940s. I mean, it seems to me that visitors are often obsessed by where and how people went to the toilet in these historical buildings, but kind of Peach set us off down on this kind of down-to-earth approach. Radio dramatists had the advantage of incorporating actual sounds and music, but it was ultimately the words that brought their plays to life, and Peach reaffirmed this in his repeated declaration that in the radio plays, words are everything. Peach's action-packed dramas are sort of, you could say they're modernist in their attention to the sound of language. He used several studios to present multiple points of view, creating juxtapositions and contrasts. Broadcast in 1929, Peach's radio drama Ingredient X was about the exploitation of African resources. Throughout the drama, Peach makes use of distinct settings, the jungle, the city, and the sea, which are signalled to listeners through changing dialects, conversational conventions, sound effects, that kind of thing. There's a board meeting about the latest commercial venture, Synthetic Rubber Limited. In the African jungle, there's a rising sound of tom-toms, and a few Englishmen force Africans to dig for the mysterious Ingredient X. On a ship, a captain faces a great storm that causes its cargo, a shipment of Ingredient X, to shift, resulting in certain disaster. Each scene kind of creates a diversity of voices that find connection only through Ingredient X. The extent to which many of the characters are living a lie is highlighted through the juxtaposition of several contradictory scenes and perspectives. Peach presents the ignorance and complicity of those who boast about helping the natives while benefiting them from their exploitation. At the end of the play, the ship sinks, the Englishmen in Africa are killed, the men in the boardroom congratulate themselves on their very satisfactory meeting. The listener knows that this is a fiction. The ship's not coming home, and the expedition is finished. Ingredient X was a play unlike anything that Peach had attempted before. It was an interesting aspect of the production. An interesting aspect of the production, and one that isn't really known about, was the innovative presentation of indigenous African songs. A chorus of young men had learnt in the space of a few hours. A planter's wife, Mrs. Ella Kidney, had collected them travelling up and down the Zambezi River, and she collected tribal songs, natural expressions of sorrow and rejoicing, harvest dancing, preparation for war. And she said listeners will hear them entirely free of alteration or adaptation. Young men who will chant picked up the intonation very quickly. I mean, there's a question mark here about a planter's wife presenting African songs, but certainly there was a feeling, there was a kind of attention to kind of authenticity. No one had done this before to a prime radio audience. So Peach's stance on racial issues was more nuanced than many of his contemporaries, and his attitudes arguably ahead of his time. His presentation of corporate greed and the exploitation of Africa spurred a contemporary journalist to complain that the play was, quote, Bolshevik in tendency. We don't expect the author of Ladybird Books' history to be accused of Bolshevism, but perhaps, as we saw, his interpretation of the Pilgrimage of Grace had a slightly Marxist tinge to it. So going on to films, L Du Garde Peach produced more than 30 scripts and scenarios for films. Notable films were The Red Ensign, 1934, directed by the young Michael Powell, The Tunnel, The Great Mr. Handel, Get Cracking, 1943, which starred George Formby. Get Cracking was a kind of Home Guard themed caper, which Peach adapted from his own play According to Plan, a play which in turn was influenced by his own experiences as a major in the Home Guard. In Music Hath Charms, He devised what was essentially one of the first pop videos, or a proto-pop video, nearly 30 years before the Beatles' A Hard Day's Night. Great Cracking was Peach's last film, but a number of his plays were adapted for television. In the end, Peach resisted the lure of Hollywood or of a career as a film script writer, which had at one point seen as a genuine possibility. He chose to remain in the high peak of Derbyshire, but maintain a national reputation. So the film, I mean, one of the reasons why Peach went into films was that there was a kind of, the BBC didn't pay as much as they do today. There was a reluctance to poach well-known figures from the stage, and that's partly why Peach had got his break in the radio in the first place. But they just weren't paying super salaries. You're going to be comfortable. You were never really going to get a fat fee. So. And the radio broadcasts themselves attracted a one-off fee, whereas if you'd been running for the West End or something, you've had a kind of revenue flow. And so Peach liked the money, disliked the censorship of the BBC. He had a friend, W.P. Lipscomb, who was already writing film scripts. And yeah, he made that transition into writing film scripts. He found the film work, though, lucrative but unsatisfying. He said, "You were paid a handsome cheque for your script, ushered out of the door, and then the filmmen ruthlessly start to cut it about. They don't care what they did. So they just cut things out." He said once he refused to let a film go forward with his name on it. And he said, "Some of my scripts, and I've written 30 or 40, were thrown out, but only after they'd been paid for. The trouble with films was that the companies just had too much money. That's why films are so bad. They're written for people with a mental age of 11. But as he said, audiences are now becoming more sophisticated." Let's look at one of his films, Music Hath Charms, from 1935. It's a vehicle for the British band leader Henry Hall, made nearly 30 years before the Beatles' film A Hard Day's Night. But there are certain kind of similarities. So, A Hard Day's Night, the genre is a review style of hit songs, proto-pop video, elements of music, comedy, reverence, drama, and multiple lines of narrative. So the same. The plot: zany day in the life of a band. Ringo Starr arrested, Henry Hall arrested, escapes. Makes it to the broadcasting studio in the nick of time. It's the legacy of Hard Day's Night is widely regarded as pioneering the kind of pop video or the proto-pop video. Music Hath Charms, much less well known, but some scholars have seen it as pioneering a new trend. One thing that connects both of them is Gilbert Taylor, who later worked on The Omen and Star Wars in the 1970s and was director of cinematography for A Hard Day's Night, and also worked on Music Hath Charms in 1935. So he's a kind of connecting figure there. So Music Hath Charms, as I said, was a vehicle to promote the band leader Henry Hall. The main subject of the story is a big party arranged by Henry Hall for a big group of children. They start from London in a convoy of posh cars, singing and shouting their way through London, and they're sort of playing hide and seek in the countryside. Hall loses the children and the band. He kind of gets arrested as a suspicious character. The car and driver is fed up with waiting, decide to abandon the party. Henry Hall escapes, dashes to Broadcasting House just in time for his 5:15 broadcast, but without the band. He starts to play his own signature tune on the piano without thinking how to produce 45 minutes of dance music without a band. Fortunately, the band arrive one by one within the first 5 minutes, and the situation is saved. So, meanwhile, outside the studio, then there's a slightly zaniness to this. And slightly things that wouldn't be done today, like the jungle scene with cannibals, a bit of racial stereotyping there, and a group of mountain climbers being rescued by music, which is slightly unusual. Something that starts and music is starting and ending relationships. There's slightly a curious aspect to some of this. One of the myths of the 1960s was everything was new and different, but a lot of it had been done before. And here I've got a scene here from Music Hath Charms. Check out the dancing policeman.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Henry Hall speaking. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Henry Hall speaking. We begin this program with a piano solo. Some can also be played as a duet. And also as a trio. I think I'll call that number just a little bit.
In the 1940s and 1950s, Peach's career shifted focus again. He became an in-demand producer of historical pageants, a pageant master for places such as Sheffield, Nottingham, Tamworth, the Isle of Man, and a variety of organisations such as the Transport and General Workers Union, the Cooperative Movement, the Scouts, the Chartered Institute of Secretaries. In 1946, he produced an historical confection yield of the years for Newton Chambers and Company, the well-known manufacturers of the curiously shiny and unforgiving Izal toilet paper. Some of the older members might remember. Peach's pageants were not always a success with the critics or even later academics, not least he was often pulled in too many directions. But he was one of the few people who could manage to produce a cast of hundreds or thousands and put on a respectable performance on a tight timescale and on a shoestring budget. He transformed his experiences of committees and pageant producing into a comedy he called The Town That Would Have a Pageant, 1951, which is about the staging of a quincentenary pageant in the fictional town of Mangle Worthington. In turn, this play sparked an incident when the town clerk of Abergavenny tried to ban it, and this led to a question in Parliament. In 1963, L Du Garde Peach surprised guests at the Cutlers Feast in Sheffield by giving a toast in the form of a pageant. Proposing the toast of the Company of Cutlers in Hallamshire, he quoted Chaucer's lines depicting the miller. and went on, if only we could see him in his habit as he lived. Suddenly a miller in the costume of 1380 appeared and bowed to the guests. As Peach continued, cutlers of 1554 to the Victorian era, 6 of them entered and stood in the spotlight. He pointed out that the first cutler's feast under the frugal James I cost only 6 shillings. 1771, 3 dukes and 5 earls were entertained for £50. In 1951, the Chartered Institute of Secretaries celebrated its Diamond Jubilee. To mark the occasion, a dance was held in the London Guildhall, followed by a masque, Semper Vigilans, which was written by L Du Garde Peach. 4 famous secretaries of the past were made the central figures of the masque: Geoffrey Chaucer, William Cecil, John Milton and Samuel Pepys. It was said to be the first masque performed since Elizabethan times in the Guildhall, where this was the only form of entertainment permitted under licence. First of the 4 secretaries was Chaucer. When, as the King's secretary in the matter of building the castle of Windsor, he was shown encountering the wife of Bath, and drawing from their meeting his inspiration for his Canterbury tales. In the next scene, there was a tempestuous Queen Elizabeth, in which he discussed with William Cecil the future of England. The secretary stipulated for a necessary term of austerity, the Queen yet assuring him that England shall not always be poor. As a reviewer noted, with the appearance of John Milton at the moment of him being offered the post of Latin Secretary to the Parliamentary Committee of Foreign Affairs in a Puritan England, some of the glow and of colour sort of left the Chronicle. But as compensation, there was a musing Puritan ballet of virtuous maidens being tempted to play ball with 3 cheerful devils. Peach attracted some social media controversy. In 2018, the well-known historian Helen Castor posted some images on Twitter, quite critical of Peach, and she said it's interesting to see what details about Elizabeth's early family life L Du Garde Peach chose to leave out. The idea is he's chosen to leave things out. There's definitely an argument here, but this is a children's book, so it's perhaps a little unfair to compare him to an academic treatise, an academic book. And she emphasises his seeming like anti-Catholicism, although maybe he's a little bit more balanced than that, and goes on about Mary being a Catholic. Again, Mary was a strange woman, which you can pick up on. And commenting on this, Dana Rayborn, I think, who writes kind of historical novels. I think in American he writes his historical novels, picks up on the name. We're just breezing past L Du Garde Peach. We're not going to talk about that. And then Helen Cass said, sorry, that's L Du Garde Peach, MA, PhD, D.Lit, that's my bad. Obviously, he's got academic qualifications, and as you know, he's entitled to use them, I guess. And that's how we signal some kind of authority. So I think Peach was a kind of a student of literature by training rather than an academic historian. And he came at the task with a kind of a fresh perspective, certainly his own perspective. Every word was carefully chosen, every sentence carefully weighed. As an accomplished radio dramatist, he was interested in how material sounded when read aloud. His writing was well crafted, artful. He had a tendency to kind of recycle and repurpose material that was going back decades. And certainly the adventures from history served up a version of history with its own spin. They tended to focus on how powerful personalities, usually men, but not always, shaped history. And some people say that you could call this kind of adventurers from history rather than adventures from history. And I suppose part of the magic of the books in some ways comes from the striking colour illustrations, many of them done by John Kenny. So the Peach-Kenny partnership lasted 17 years and produced sort of 27 books, well, slightly more than that actually. The books were sort of dynamic interplay of text and pictures, a sort of pocket-sized Gesamtkunstwerk. Peach's experience as a playwright and a dramatist propelled him regularly towards the anecdotal, giving his illustrators sort of step-by-step opportunities for dramatic pitches, and this was appreciated in the market. For all Peach's talents as a storyteller, one of the issues with the books was that having whetted the reader's appetite, there weren't really any suggestions for further reading, anything that could add substance to this kind of sketch that had been offered. And also, I suppose, at the height of their popularity and success, there was a sense that Ladybird history books contained the seeds of their own destruction. even as early as the late 1960s, the books were starting to look old-fashioned in formal content. Television was making children's taste more sophisticated, slicker and more sophisticated. So I guess when it comes to history, Peach was primarily interested in the past as theatre, as a kind of a prime site for a kind of literary or dramatic archaeological investigation or quarrying, and the transformation of material into archetypes or antitypes. And so he had a kind of lyrical engagement with life and with the past, and sort of kind of revelled in this kind of idiosyncratic approach. He's a man who could see both sides of an argument, but he could also hold two seemingly contradictory ideas in his head at the same time. As I tried to suggest, he is a product of the Edwardian avant-garde in the First World War, and he was seemed to be a little bit bewildered by the 1960s. Maybe he became relatively more conservative, or it was just that maybe social conventions moved ahead of him. Adventures from History presented sometimes questionable views of the past, but the magic of the books with their images made them very valuable. So at the time of his death in 1974, Peach warranted only short obituaries, but for enthusiasts today, his books conjure fondly remembered episodes of childhood. I mean, Peach is an adapter and an originator, but it's hard to think of someone who's produced such quality material over such a long period of time. I mean, years and years and years, from 30s, 40s, and 50s. It's not the greatest work in history, and as we've seen, the books present a number of problems. But I think he kind of has served up a version of the past which we can critique, but it's a version of the past that is there and is important to many people. I think that is where I'm going to leave it.